We live in a world that glorifies intelligence. People are taught that the smarter they are, the more successful, respected, and capable they will be. Intelligence is associated with logic, strategy, and careful decision-making, while foolishness is seen as a weakness, something to be avoided at all costs. No one wants to be the fool. But history tells a different story. The fool has existed in every culture, in every society, often overlooked and ridiculed, yet always playing a crucial role. He is the jester, the wanderer, the one who stumbles his way through life, yet somehow manages to reveal the truth that others fail to see. He is dismissed as naive, yet he dares to challenge the structures that even the most intelligent people unquestioningly obey. He is reckless, but he is also free. The fool is not bound by logic, nor is he weighed down by hesitation. He does not analyze every decision, does not fear making mistakes, does not seek approval from those around him. And in doing so, he moves through life in a way that the so-called wise cannot. He does not overthink, he does not strategize, he simply acts. While others remain paralyzed by fear of failure, by the need for validation, by the pressure to be right, the fool moves forward. Not because he knows what he is doing, but because he is not afraid of not knowing. Throughout history, the fool has played a critical role in shaping how we understand truth and wisdom. In medieval courts, jesters were not just there for entertainment. They were often the only ones who could speak freely to the king without fear of execution. They disguised their insights in humor, but beneath the laughter they were revealing uncomfortable truths that no one else dared to say aloud. In literature, Don Quixote was mocked for his delusions, yet he embodied a deeper truth about human idealism, about the way we construct our own realities. In philosophy, Socrates questioned everything, challenging the wisdom of Athens, only to be condemned for exposing the ignorance of others. And in tarot, the fool represents the beginning of a journey, the willingness to step into the unknown without hesitation, without fear. Society conditions us to value intelligence above all else, but what if, in doing so, we have lost something? What if the fool, in his ignorance, possesses a kind of wisdom that the intelligent cannot access? What if his lack of hesitation, his disregard for social norms, his willingness to make mistakes, are not flaws, but advantages? It is easy to dismiss the fool. It is easy to assume that because he does not think like the rest of us, he must be inferior. But history has proven that those who embrace their foolishness, who dare to question, who refuse to conform, often end up changing the world. The question is, have we been looking at foolishness all wrong? There has always been a place for the fool in history, though few recognize just how significant his role has been. He is often overlooked, treated as nothing more than an entertainer or a distraction. Yet time and time again, he proves to be something much more. The fool does not simply amuse, he exposes, he disrupts, and, most importantly, he reveals truths that others are too afraid to confront. In medieval courts, jesters were the only ones who could mock the king without fear of punishment. Hidden beneath their jokes was a power that no advisor, no nobleman, no politician had: the ability to speak the truth without consequence. While the so-called wise men of the court were careful with their words, calculating how to remain in favor, the fool had no such concerns. He was expected to be ridiculous, to speak nonsense, and in that nonsense, he could slip in the most uncomfortable truths without ever being seen as a threat. But this isn't just a phenomenon of the past. Literature and philosophy have long recognized that those who are seen as foolish often possess a deeper understanding of reality, than those who are praised for their intellect. Don Quixote, for example, is mocked as a madman, yet his refusal to accept the limitations of the world around him makes him one of the most profoundly honest characters in literature. Socrates, who called himself ignorant, was sentenced to death because his questions exposed the ignorance of those who claimed to be wise. And then there is the fool in tarot, the archetype of pure potential, of stepping into the unknown with no fear of failure. While others hesitate, waiting until they have all the answers, the fool takes action. He does not need certainty to move forward. He does not need approval. He simply goes. Society often dismisses those who do not conform to its definition of intelligence. But history suggests that those who dare to embrace their foolishness, who do not fear looking ridiculous, who challenge the status quo, not with strategy or calculation, but with unfiltered truth, are the ones who shape the world in ways no one expects. Not everything that seems foolish is without meaning. While society conditions people to equate intelligence with competence and ignorance with failure, history suggests a more complicated reality. The fool does not abide by the constraints of conventional logic, and because of that, he often sees what the so-called wise fail to recognize. The paradox of the fool is this: he appears to know nothing, yet his ignorance allows him to see everything. A person burdened by knowledge can become trapped in overanalysis, hesitation, and self-doubt. The fool, on the other hand, moves without hesitation, unafraid of making mistakes, unafraid of being wrong. And in doing so, he discovers truths that remain hidden to those who overthink, who fear failure, who cling to certainty. Psychologists call this the beginner's mind, the ability to approach life without preconceptions, to see things as they are, rather than through the lens of past experiences. A child, unaware of social norms, may ask a question that exposes a contradiction in the way adults think. A fool, unburdened by the fear of looking ridiculous, may say something absurd that reveals a hidden truth. History is full of moments where the fool, the outcast, the one dismissed as irrelevant, ends up changing the course of events. Socrates, condemned for his ignorance, exposed the blindness of those who considered themselves wise. Galileo, ridiculed for challenging the established view of the universe, was later proven correct. The Joker, a modern cultural representation of the fool, is both a source of chaos and a brutal truth-teller, revealing the hypocrisy of the very society that condemns him. In every system of power, there exists an unspoken rule. The higher one climbs, the less they can say. Kings, rulers, and those in authority are bound by expectations, political correctness, and the fear of consequences. They are constantly surrounded by advisors, strategists, and intellectuals, people who analyze every word, calculate every move, and ensure that nothing said or done will jeopardize their position. But among all these powerful figures, there is always one person who speaks freely: the fool. It might seem ironic that the weakest figure in the room is often the only one who can control the strongest. The court jester, for example, held no political power. He had no wealth, no army, no alliances. Yet, he had something that no nobleman, no general, no advisor could ever have: the ability to speak the truth without consequence. In medieval courts, kings surrounded themselves with people who told them what they wanted to hear. Ministers flattered them, advisors reassured them, and enemies plotted in silence. The jester, however, had nothing to gain and nothing to lose. He entertained, he joked, he played the fool, but beneath the laughter was a deeper role. He could criticize without being punished, expose corruption without being exiled, and tell the king what no one else dared to say. His humor protected him, but his words carried weight. This is not just a relic of the past. The same pattern exists today, hidden in modern society. Comedians, satirists, and provocateurs hold a unique power over politicians, corporations, and public figures. They disguise truth as humor, mock authority in ways that would be dangerous if spoken seriously, and, in doing so, shape the opinions of entire societies. And yet, despite all this, the fool is never taken seriously. And that is his greatest advantage. Because he is underestimated, he can say what others cannot. Because he is not seen as a threat, he can challenge those in power without consequence. And because he has nothing to prove, he remains the freest person in any system of control. But what happens when the fool is no longer playing? What happens when the laughter fades and people realize that the joke was never really a joke? History has shown that the fool's power is not always harmless. The Joker archetype in modern culture represents what happens when the fool becomes dangerous, when his ability to mock, to expose, to break rules is turned into something destructive. A fool who loses his innocence, who becomes bitter, who stops laughing, can become a force of pure chaos. The power of the fool has always been overlooked, dismissed as irrelevant. But those who have ruled the world have always known the truth. A fool may not have a throne, but he has something far more valuable: the ability to change the way people think. And in the end, that is what truly controls the world. For most of history, the fool has played the role of a harmless truth-teller, someone who exposes contradictions, challenges authority, and questions reality in a way that is not perceived as a threat. But there is a fine line between a fool who enlightens and a fool who destroys. When the fool loses his innocence, when he stops laughing and begins to take himself seriously, he no longer disrupts the system. He seeks to tear it down. In mythology and literature, the fool often starts as a light-hearted wanderer, someone who makes mistakes but means no harm. He is Don Quixote chasing illusions. He is the court jester mocking the king. He is the fool in tarot stepping into the unknown with blind optimism. But there is another version of the fool, one who has seen too much, who has been rejected, who has learned that the world does not laugh with him, but at him. And when that happens, the fool no longer exposes truth with humor, he exposes it with fire. The most infamous example of this is the Joker, a character who has evolved beyond the role of the playful trickster into a symbol of pure chaos. The Joker, at his core, is the fool who has been broken by the world. He no longer mocks the system. He seeks to watch it burn. He is the court jester whose warnings were ignored for too long, who was cast aside until his laughter became something else entirely. He no longer speaks uncomfortable truths to power. Instead, he shows power that it is meaningless. In the real world, we see echoes of this transformation in history. There are figures who started as outcasts, dismissed as irrelevant, only to later become symbols of upheaval. When the fool is rejected, ridiculed, and alienated for too long, he ceases to be harmless. He begins to embrace his role as an agent of destruction, no longer interested in revealing flaws, only in tearing them apart. The fool has always been an unpredictable force. He can be the one who challenges ideas to make them stronger, or he can be the one who dismantles them entirely. Whether he is a source of wisdom or a catalyst for chaos depends entirely on how the world chooses to treat him. In every system of power, control is the foundation that keeps everything intact. Governments rely on laws, corporations rely on structure, and societies rely on shared norms to maintain order. Those in power use influence, status, and social pressure to keep people in line, ensuring that rebellion, unpredictability, and chaos are minimized. But there is one figure who exists outside of this structure, one person who refuses to be controlled, one archetype that authority can never fully suppress. The fool. The fool is an anomaly. He does not play by the same rules as everyone else because he does not acknowledge those rules in the first place. He does not crave validation like the intellectual, nor does he fear rejection like the politician. He does not seek wealth, status, or approval, making him the only person in a society obsessed with control who is truly free, and that is exactly why he is dangerous. Throughout history, the fool has always been a disruptive force. In medieval courts, jesters had the rare privilege of mocking the king, exposing flaws in leadership that no advisor dared to point out. In philosophy, thinkers like Socrates, who questioned the very foundations of knowledge, were seen as threats not because they were violent or rebellious, but because they undermined the illusion of certainty. Even in modern times, satirists and comedians hold a unique power, challenging authority through humor, revealing contradictions in the systems people have blindly accepted. What makes the fool untouchable is that he has nothing to lose. The businessman fears bankruptcy, the ruler fears revolution, the intellectual fears being proven wrong. But the fool? He fears nothing because he does not attach his identity to success, status, or reputation. He is free to speak the truth, mock the system, and challenge authority without hesitation, because no amount of punishment can take away something he never valued in the first place. This is why societies have always tried to silence or dismiss the fool. He does not obey, he does not conform, and most importantly, he reveals that many of the rules people live by are just illusions. The fool exposes the arbitrary nature of hierarchy, the absurdity of rigid belief systems, and the fragility of power structures that depend on unquestioning obedience. And because he cannot be controlled, he becomes a permanent threat to those who seek to maintain order. And yet, despite all attempts to erase him, the fool never disappears. He is ridiculed, underestimated, and ignored, but he always finds a way to resurface, laughing at the absurdity of a world that takes itself too seriously, refusing to play a game that everyone else is desperately trying to win. There comes a point when people start to question everything they once believed, the systems they trusted, the rules they followed, the knowledge they thought was absolute. It all begins to unravel. And in moments like these, the fool is no longer just a joke. He becomes something else entirely. Throughout history, the fool has been ignored, dismissed, and ridiculed. He has been laughed at for not taking things seriously, for breaking rules, for rejecting logic. But what people fail to understand is that the fool has never played by their rules in the first place. He does not seek validation. He does not need approval. And because of that, he is the only one who can see things for what they truly are. Philosophers have long understood that wisdom is not about knowing all the answers. It is about being able to question everything. Those who believe they are intelligent cling to certainty, to structure, to what makes them feel in control. The fool does the opposite. He embraces the unknown. He welcomes contradiction. And that is why, no matter how many times he is cast aside, he always returns. The world fears what it cannot control, and the fool is the one thing that will never be controlled. He does not need power, wealth, or recognition. He does not seek to lead, yet he is the one who influences the way people think. He does not claim to be wise, yet his words often outlast those of scholars, rulers, and intellectuals. The role of the fool has never been to follow. It has never been to conform. His purpose is to remind the world that sometimes the only way to see the truth is to step outside of it, to embrace uncertainty, to challenge what seems obvious, to laugh at what others take seriously. And that is why, long after the kings have fallen, the rulers have been replaced, and the systems have changed, the fool remains.